Have you been wondering what weapons that you should run in Season 18? Is the fear of missing out on the right weapon, or that you're using the wrong loadout for the wrong situation, leaving you sleepless at night? It's understandable with all the changes to the Season 18 weapons, so I figured it's about time that we fix that with the Season 18 weapon tier list. In this video, we'll go over what weapons you want to run for the optimal experience, and while yes, it is early in the season, and odds are some weapons might end up being a little bit more popular down the line, I do believe we have a good read on the weapons this season. So, enough talking, let's dive straight into it. I want to start the video off with some of the weapons that have received the, most notable changes. The first one that comes to mind being the Spitfire. When I read the patch notes for the Spitfire, I was making a quick mention of how I really hope that they won't make it as bad as it used to be, because this thing used to be a beast. This season's addition with the hipfire spread, the aim down sights recoil, and of course the addition of barrel stabilizers has turned this thing into what used to be something that's annoying to deal with to a real threat over mid-ranges. The low damage per second does mean you will get out-dueled by SMGs or some ARs, but if you are taking a fight over a mid to a longer range, a Spitfire user will beam your entire team before you even manage to get close, without even needing to reload, packing as much as 1,350 damage per full magazine, being an absolute menace if you don't respect it, and if you do manage to close the gap, the new hipfire spread means that you'll get beamed without them having to aim at you. With the knocks I've seen so far this season, and the potential shreddage that this thing allows, I will have to place the Spitfire in the A tier. Another weapon that saw some interesting changes was one of the many shotguns, that being the Mastiff. The Mastiff's spread has been, dare I say, greatly reduced, and what was once a pea shooter is still a pea shooter, but its effective range is about twice as far as it used to be, and you can still hit some decent shots at the midway ranges. I do think that the Mastiff's changes have been overhyped this season when compared to the Peacekeeper that we will see later in the video, but it's clear to say that the shotgun meta might be around the corner. Personally, I still want to see a type of hop-up where you end up holding the Mastiff like a gangster, you know, tilting it 90 degrees. But you know, that's just me. In the meantime, I'll place the Mastiff in the C tier. But where does that leave the Devotion? I've gone on record so many times saying that with how many items you need to kit out the Devotion, just to have a pretty measly damage that still needs to be charged up. As in, if you have a turbocharger, you still don't deal max DPS until a decent way into your magazine, and that means it's pretty bad. Dare I say one of, if not the worst weapon in the game, and that's even more true in Season 18 now that loot is scarce. And kitting out an expensive Devotion just isn't worth it. The last few days where I've been trying to get background footage for these videos, I don't think I ever got to fully kit out a Devotion once. And it's worth mentioning that the other weapon I normally compare to the Devotion actually got a buff this season, but as far as the Devotion goes, I have to place it in the F tier. The other weapon I was talking about is the P2020, but you might be confused because there weren't any buffs, right? So there were buffs, but it wasn't listed in the patch notes. It turns out, to the surprise that nobody, that the P2020 had a bit of an issue. It had an incredibly high first shot inaccuracy. This means that the first bullet that you fired out of the P2020, not out of the magazine mind you, but the first shot after your recoil had been stabilized, was a lot more inaccurate, leading to plenty of moments like this one. With this change, the P2020 feels a lot nicer, and dare I say, at least better than the F tier. So with that in mind, I'll be placing the P2020 in the D tier. And moving on, I want to quickly mention a sniper because going off my public matches, snipers are definitely making a return this season. And the longbow is of course the first sniper that comes to mind. The longbow did not receive any changes this season and is mostly honestly unaffected by the loot changes, as you don't really need any specific upgrades to bring out the best of it. Sure, a good magazine size and stock helps with securing kills, but you can still get by with white basic attachments or none at all as well. Like honestly, who even equips a barrel stabilizer on this thing? I swear most people just do it to flex. The longbow is a pretty decent sniper/marksman weapon and a middle-of-the-pack weapon in general, so I'm gonna place it in the C tier. Another weapon that was considered to be the middle of the pack, but now is starting to see a little bit more of attention, is of course the alternator. Seeing disruptors coming back to the alternator sent me down into a mental state of disarray that I still haven't come back from, because this thing used to hit hard. Now thankfully, the disruptor rounds only raise the shield damage by 20% per shot this time around, giving it a damage per second of a 190 against shields and 160 without shields, or the hop-up, making it slightly more viable, and I guess in a way sort of a competitor to the car SMG when it comes to building something like an R9. But the car SMG does vastly more damage and is much cheaper to build rather than a weapon that requires a golden attachment to even be considered a competitor in the first place. And I believe that at the end of the day, the R99 should be the end-all be-all when it comes to an SMG primary. And as such, I'll place the alternator in the B tier. Now let's talk about another weapon that has been seeing some changes this season, where we are also seeing the return of a once forgotten hop-up. That being the Wingman. I already love the Wingman, and I would place it at the top of any tier when given the chance. It's a high-risk, high-reward weapon that's fairly difficult to face against when played right, and with the nerf to the SMG aim down sight strafe speed, and this gives the Wingman even more of a leg up when it comes to an SMG versus Wingman duel. The boosted loader does give you a faster reload and a free bullet overload on your magazine when you reload a Wingman with a few bullets left, giving you a few more bullets to work with. But honestly, in most cases, I feel like the Wingman has more than enough bullets to work with in most magazines. And historically speaking, I always want to choose a skull piercer rather than a boosted loader for the Wingman. With all of this said, I normally put the Wingman around the A tier, but today I'm feeling a little bit frisky, and these meta changes are making me feel some type of way, so let's do a big statement and place the Wingman in the S tier. And while we're at the subject of the S, let's talk about the Scout. Other than losing, the double tap, and honestly, we even used it in the first place, the Scout hasn't seen any changes this season. I feel like it's sort of becoming the lifeline of marksman weapons, as all other rifles continue getting buffs to them, while leaving the Scout in the dirt. Don't get me wrong, it's still pretty good, but I've found myself swapping it out almost every game that I play, no matter whether it's in ranked or the more competitive mode that's being pubs. So I will place the Scout in the C tier. And something else that starts on C has to be the car SMG, which is the first of all of the SMGs in the game that is supposed to have received a nerf to its aim down sight speed. At the time of making this video, the speed has not been changed, but it will be down the line, so I will rate it as such. With the R99 returning to the ground loot, this does add some competition and almost sort of a rivalry between the car SMG and the R99 in competing for the best weapon. And I would say that the car itself works as a great midway placeholder weapon with an excellent time to kill, a good economy, and a large magazine size. It is the perfect, pretty easy to handle weapon until you do end up finding the R99. So if you do have the chance, try to carry light ammo instead of heavy, and light magazines instead of heavy on the gun, just in case you end up finding an R99 down the line. And we're gonna place the car in the A tier. Another SMG that we haven't mentioned yet is the RE45. The RE45 did not receive any direct changes to its strength this season, but the changes to the hammer point were felt. I'd say that the RE45 may have been getting either a soft nerf, since the hammer points are harder to find now, or you could consider it got a soft buff, since if you really want those hammer points, you can just craft a Mozambique and take the hammer points for yourself. You can also run the throwback loadout of the RE45 and the alternator with disruptors for some extra cheese. But at the end of the day, that's all it is, it's cheese, and I'm just not about that cheddar. I think that these extra gimmicks just make the weapons more expensive and difficult to build, and most of the time, you should just be picking a good weapon instead, like the R99. I will be placing the RE45 in the D tier. Another throwback weapon will have to be the Hemlock, which finally returned to the floor this season. With a supposed recoil increase, like seriously, I don't even notice it, and a very slight damage reduction per bullet from 23 to 22, and a slightly reduced headshot multiplier. The changes are barely felt, and with how all the other weapons are performing this season, it's safe to say that despite all odds, the Hemlock is somehow doing better than lots of them. I have a tendency of rating burst weapons really low on this channel, because the stats on their own don't really support a good rating. I mean, the Hemlock sits at a damage per second of 161. It's the same as an alternator without disruptor rounds. But yet it can beam due to how easy it is to control and how good it is around corners. It also has the ability to equip a boosted loader, but just like with the Wingman, I honestly don't consider it that much of a game changer. Personally, I don't think I'll be using the Hemlock this season, but I will give it some credibility and place it in the B tier. The Triple Take is another mid to long range marksman weapon that didn't see changes this season, so I don't really have much to add. As far as the meta goes, I don't think its place has changed, but obviously it is better than in the last few seasons, since you can actually have some range with it now. Obviously, despite the buffs it had received previously, it is still sitting at the bottom of the marksman rifles, the only redeeming quality being that it's good for quickscopes. And all this quickscope talk kind of reminds me of FaZe Clan, which, much like the triple take, belongs in the D tier. And while we're at the subject of energy weapons and wildly overrated things, let's talk about everyone's favorite, the Nemesis. Oh, the Nemesis. The one weapon I kept saying, it's overrated. I placed it in the B tier in my previous tier list. I took backlash for it, and it's something I've been getting hate and getting dogged on for the last season or so. But why is it that despite being so overpowered, it was still rarely picked up or used that much in the previous season? Anyways, the Nemesis is in the crafter now, and some sweaty kids still think it is the bee's knees and will go out of their way to craft it. Not that it makes a difference, they're still not going to win any games playing like that. Anyway, sorry, I never let things go. About the rating, I'll vouch that while I placed the Nemesis a little bit too low since I did rate it against SMGs instead of ARs, which is the range you normally use it at, I still think that the Nemesis is overhyped, and if we ignore that you can only get it in the crafter, I'll place it in the A tier this season because I'm so tired of getting dogpiled on. But I could see it being a B tier weapon as well, depending on the day, the lobbies, and the loadouts. And of course, what goes hand in hand with the Nemesis, you know, when it comes to sweaty loadouts and all, there's always going to be the R99. And let it be known, not that it should be any surprise by now, I'm a bit of an R99 simp. Probably the biggest one since seasons back. Even when people doubted me and said, oh no, the Prowler is actually better. No, R99 has always been all the way. So what about Season 18? Thankfully, even finally, it has returned to ground loot, but the R99 has run into some issues this season. The 1 bullet per magazine nerf makes it a tiny bit more punishing to use, to the point where I wouldn't pick it up without a light magazine, and the recoil change is definitely noticeable. I still think I need to spend some more time in the range to really nail the new recoil down, but as with any guns, I'm sure it can be learned. Out of all of the ground weapons, it still has the highest consistent damage per second of 216, which is more than enough to beam anyone who might be coming your way, and as such, I'll place the R99 in the S tier. But let's talk about another weapon that everybody wants to know about. That's right, we're talking about Sheila. Normally, I don't feature legend-specific weapons in the tier list, but I feel like mixing it up a little bit. Because Sheila is a great gun, to the point where if you have sufficient space, I'd argue that it's one of the best weapons in the game. Now, the slowdown from revving it or shooting it will make you an easy target, but it can be offset with movement or other smaller tricks if you're good enough. All things considered, I'll place Sheila in the A tier. And speaking of easy targets, what about the 3030? The 3030 repeater, and I can already tell you guys are gonna comment on the way I pronounce it, is a pretty solid gun. When lined up against most of the other marksman weapons, dare I say it might even be the best marksman weapon in the game right now. The larger bullets that you receive from the charge up is huge, and making your snipes a cakewalk. Like, seriously, sometimes I hit the first shot, I think I'm gonna beam the guy, and end up missing everything else because I no longer have that massive bullet doing work for me. I think everyone will be picking out the 3030 for longer range engagements this season, so I will place it in the A tier. But now, for something completely different, let's talk about the Prowler. I am so happy that the Prowler comes with a select fire again. I've been waiting for it for so long. It feels so good, almost a bit too good. The new Prowler has to be the best gun in the game at the moment, like hands down. Sure, it's in the care package, but it now deals 1 additional damage per bullet, and on its own, it doesn't seem like much. But was it even needed? Because once you look at the full auto stats, with a 35 bullet magazine, a nearly non-existent recoil, and 212 damage per second, there's not a single gun it can be compared to. And you're gonna say, oh well, yeah, what about the R9? You just said it's the best gun in the game. Yeah, I'll concede that the Prowler has 4 less damage per second than the R99, but you can fire it for so much longer thanks to the magazine size, and again, you can't even feel the recoil, whereas the R99 comparatively kicks like a mule. So where am I gonna place it? It's clearly better than the R99, it's the best gun in the game. I'm gonna place it in the P tier for Prowler. Yeah, I'm making up tiers now. Sue me. Now let's talk about another gun, the Kraber. I have such a hard time making up my mind where I want to place the Kraber ever since it received the nerfs to its headshot damage, barring it from being a guaranteed one-hit kill on a headshot. I mean, it will still do devastating damage on a headshot, but not getting a knock feels really bad, and I want to feel good if I'm shooting my guns. Sure, you can still use the damage to close a gap and fight with a health advantage, but it's way different than moving in on a knock. That being said, since the Kraber still one-hit kills enemies under a certain armor and helmet level, it is worth noting that the changes to the armor and the overall loot, in a way, was sort of a buff to the Kraber this season. You're way more likely to run into an enemy struggling with loot and becoming an easy one-shot kill, so with that in mind, I'll put the Kraber in the A tier. But what about the R301? While it hasn't seen any changes this season, I've actually found myself running it a lot more often than I normally would. This may be since I want to gain some distance from certain enemies who instantly beam me if I get too close, or because I don't feel like carrying around an alternator or RA45 while trying to get attachments to make myself an R99. I mean, yeah, the aim down sight speed is still slower than the SMG counterparts, but the recoil is pretty manageable over most ranges, and the damage per second isn't too bad at 176, so I really think that this can serve as a decent stepping stone once you progress through the game. And after much deliberation, I'll place the R301 in the B tier. But now let's talk about another weapon that just saw a straight up buff this season that I'm dying to talk about, and that is the Peacekeeper. Because the Peacekeeper takes disruptors now. Go figure. I've actually been joking about this for the last few years, and seeing it in effect just feels wrong. Not to mention that the sound it makes is just also very wrong. It almost hurts to listen to. But that being said, the addition of disruptors has raised the Peacekeeper's damage per pellet against shields by 25%, theoretically dealing up to 121 damage for a full body pump. But honestly, the more I play it, I barely notice a difference. I don't know if that's just me or what, but it still feels like the PK hits as hard as it did before, if not worse. Anyways, let's just stick to the theory and the numbers, shall we? I think that adding the disruptors definitely makes the Peacekeeper more of a viable pick, not that I wasn't already running it, and in my opinion, it's now even more worth it to run it as a secondary, not that it already wasn't, and now it sits in the A tier. And while you can snipe with the Peacekeeper, it's not something I recommend, so instead you could use something like the Sentinel. The Sentinel has to be one of my favorite sniper rifles, and it was my #1 pick for sniping before the charge rifle changes we saw this season, despite everyone else placing the charge rifle on top. And don't worry, we'll get to the charge rifle later. Anyways, it remains a top pick for me, as you can either use it to deal devastating damage with the charge up, you can use it as a mini Kraber to get huge entries, or just sit back with the highest damage per bullet and consistency out of all the sniper and marksman rifles, which allows you to get so much more done with the least amount of ammunition. Alongside the 3030, I'll place the Sentinel in the A tier. But now let's rip the band-aid off and talk about an SMG that you all are still putting way too much faith in, the Volt. I can't believe people still swear by the Volt in Season 18. And I have to admit, it does have a slightly higher damage per second than the R301, and it doesn't slow you down as much, but the range is questionable. And this gun is supposed to be considered one of the endgame weapons, and is somehow supposed to hold up against the CAR, the R99, or even the Prowler. I just don't see it. To make matters worse, the Volt uses energy ammo, meaning there aren't any decent guns to use while you're looking for the Volt, meaning you might spend most of your games without decent attachments. And not to mention, with almost no energy weapons being meta, it's going to be super hard to find energy ammo in the first place. I think it's better to just skip out on the Volt and focus on a build path that makes more sense. It does still have a respectable damage per second, but due to how much of a waste of time it is to actually get the Volt and kit it out, and the fact that its performance barely allows it to stand on its own, I will place it in the B tier. Moving on, let's talk about the EVA 8. The EVA 8 was the only shotgun that didn't see any changes at all this season. I mean, you know, other than the double tap, but again, who actually used this? Like, yeah, almost nobody used it on the Scout, but the EVA? Double tapping was just not worth it. Either way, with the buffs to the other shotguns in the class, the gap between the EVA and the Mastiff and the Peacekeeper is much larger than ever. The EVA on its own isn't any worse or anything, but with every other weapon that it does compete against being stronger, the only reason I really see anyone running it is to carry shotgun ammo and the occasional attachment for when you inevitably find a decent shotgun. As such, I'll put the EVA in the C tier. Another weapon that I absolutely despise, to the point that both Modon and I had to go well out of our way to even pick it up for this video, is the Rampage. The Rampage left the crafter this season, and it continues to be a waste of loot. It has a terrible damage per second without charging it up, and even if you do charge it up at the cost of 1 Thermite, with just a tiny amount of your shots actually getting charged up, it only deals a damage per second of 169, not even holding a measly candle towards the top sides of the tier list. As such, I will place the Rampage in the D tier, because while it is on par with being as horrible as the Devotion, at the very least, it's consistent. And another weapon that I have to, and usually do give props to for being consistent, is the Havoc, which basically is the Devotion, but if it were consistent. It deals decent damage, 202 DPS without a turbocharger and 190 whiff, but just like with the Devotion, it does get hit hard by loot pool changes. I do have to give some credit to how easy it is to control the recoil, but the hipfire is kind of mid, and overall despite the damage per second, I feel like it doesn't compare to the R99. Not to mention that being an energy weapon, the Havoc serves the same fate as the Volt in being a waste of time to build, when you could be gathering loot for a more valuable weapon down the line instead, like the R99. And speaking of valuable weapons, not that you could build it, is of course the Bow Kick. I'm gonna keep saying it that way and you cannot stop me. The Bow Kick compound bow remains to be one of my favorite marksmen in the game, with an incredibly high damage per second, super high per bullet or, well, arrow damage, and a very high outplay potential against other snipers and marksmen. It's a jack of all trades, but it actually does sniping right. The only problem with the bow is that it only comes in the care package, but honestly, it does get just about the right amount of arrows coming out of the care package, and ends up saving you crucial ammo space, allowing you to pack other things, so I consider that trade-off worth it. As such, I'll place the Bow Kick in the A tier. Another care package weapon that definitely is being slept on has to be the L-Star EMG. The L-Star already had disruptor rounds way before they made their way back as ground loot this season, and they're nothing to scoff at. The L-Star's 250 damage per second against armored targets, and 160 against unarmored ones, all with a decent range, with the ability to equip marksman scopes, not to mention that the bullets pass through enemies so you can hit many with the same shots as well, makes it a beast. All in all, it's a devastating powerhouse of damage to open up a team fight, and the only reason I cannot put it as high as the S tier is because it's a care package weapon with very limited ammo, and this being an automatic weapon that you usually use for poking, kind of needs a big reserve of just that. But that being said, I will still place the L-Star in the A tier, so let's just move on with another mid-range weapon that I personally am not a huge fan of, but I can certainly see the vision, and that's the Flatline. I found myself using the Flatline more as a secondary weapon, almost like a full automatic version of a marksman rifle, specifically to deal damage over the longer ranges while still having a little bit of a versatility if the enemy does get closer. It doesn't have that high of a damage per second, and it fires almost frustratingly slow. But the Flatline does serve the benefit of having a large magazine size and having a fairly easy to learn recoil pattern, not to mention how easy it is to jitter aim with it if you're into that. And I don't think the Flatline should take the place of any weapons above the A tier, but it's certainly better than the weapons in the C tier, so we'll put the Flatline right down the middle in the B tier. After that, I want to give a quick shout out to the last shotgun in this video, that being the Mozambique. Again, the Mozambique didn't receive any changes this season, other than going into the replicator, and in a way, I guess you're guaranteed to have hammer points now, making the whole hoping to find hammer points just in order to get some value out of the gun kind of a moot point. That being said, I still don't really like the Mozambique, and I don't really see the value of using it over any other shotgun, or almost any other weapon in the game. That's because despite having guaranteed access to the hammer point rounds, they still don't make that much of a difference all things considered, and as such I'll keep the Mozambique in the D tier. But now, finally, the weapon you all have been waiting for. The weapon that I have intentionally left out until the very end of the video, just to gas up my retention numbers. By the way, did that work? Like, if you watched this long, I guess make sure to let me know in the comments. But without further ado, let's talk about the final weapon on this tier list, the Charge Rifle. This bugger received a massive rework this season, removing its only, in my opinion, redeeming quality, that being the consistent hit scan damage. With the way it's firing, now it has changed to a annoying edging your weapon mechanic, much like the Havoc, but it also added a gimmicky extra mechanic where the Charge Rifle deals more damage to enemies that happen to be farther away. Which is interesting because the Charge Rifle is the only long-distance weapon that does this, and again, it's really just a gimmick rather than something you can control. It's not like you see an enemy and either run farther back or wait for them to get farther away before you start shooting, right? If you see an enemy, you use the annoying charge-up mechanic, you line up the shot, and shoot. And if anything, since I love the idea of consistency and all, having the damage be almost an arbitrary number between 75 and 1 and 10, depending on the range, just doesn't sit right with me. But I will have to give some props to Respawn for turning the Charge Rifle from an annoying guaranteed set amount of damage into the polar opposite. All things considered, I think I'll place the Charge Rifle in the B tier. And that is it for me. If you guys disagreed with my placings, which some of you definitely will, make sure to let me know in the comments. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like, subscribe, and of course, I'll see you all tomorrow. Peace out.